Greetings. I wanted to make yet another quick video which is addressing a different portion of the video which the We Woke Now channel put out a couple of months ago. So in this video, I want to address the question, what about history, or what about the surrounding context? Now, this actually relates to a mode of argumentation that Benayah Israel had previously pushed, and perhaps Benayah even pioneered this sort of argument, where rather than just look at the markings, one considers the surrounding context, the environment, the history, which is somehow supposed to collectively point to Hebrew being more plausible or more probable than Arabic for the Pews. For example, Benayah had proposed that the Gullah people were related to the markings on the Pews, and he proposed that there's significant Hebrew influence on the Gullah dialect, but practically no significant Arabic influence on the Gullah dialect. And he tried to appeal to the writings of Lorenzo Dal Turner to buttress that position. And perhaps it's worth noting that the Orthodox Moor later put Benayah's argument under critical examination, and he wound up showing that Benayah had misrepresented both Lorenzo Dal Turner and the fact of the matter regarding the Gullah dialect. And for anyone who's interested in that, in the description of this video, I'll share a link to the video where Moore did that. But anyway, getting back to Kelly's recent video, he shared an interview with an associate minister and is executive director over at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. And the man being interviewed echoed this approach where one tries to determine the language on the pews from the larger historical context rather than just looking at the markings themselves. So we're going to pick this up at slightly after the 1 hour, 23-minute mark when Will Brown asks this gentleman why the church website started saying Arabic appeared on the pews. And the minister begins to talk about a certain tour guide who said that he saw Arabic there. And we're actually going to look at two clips, each of which will be roughly around 30 seconds long, one a little bit more, one a little bit less. And this first clip will be a bit less relevant to this discussion, on the surrounding context, but I wanted to show it because it seems to allude to external tour guides being halted in the context of one tour guide telling people that Arabic appears on the pews. So here's the first clip, and fair use.
So why the church website goes from Hebrew to, for maybe a couple of years, saying it was Arabic. Can you kind of get into that and kind of share with the audience to kind of clear that up and get some understanding on that?
Right. One of our vendors, because I heard him say it on one of his tours. Well, right now we have no vendors that are coming to the church because we're trying to sort out all of what's actually going on.
Okay, did you hear that? Am I misunderstanding that? Or did he insinuate that an external tour guide telling people Arabic appeared on the pews inspired some sort of shutdown of external tour guides until they could figure out what was going on, right? The way the 2 points were juxtaposed, the way he put the halting of external tour guides next to his issue with this tour guide telling people that Arabic appeared on the pews, the way those two things were juxtaposed certainly gives the impression that they're related. And if that's indeed what he intended to put forth, I have to say there's something almost Trumpian about that sort of comment.
Is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
But perhaps I'm reading too much into that. So let's get to the more significant clip in which this same minister and director says that external tour guide claimed to be able to read Arabic on the pews, but the response to that was that one should consult the surrounding history rather than merely what they see in the markings. So here's that clip, and again, fair use.
And I heard him say it on one of his tours, and I asked him, I said, well, why do you say it's Arabic? And everyone else before has said it's Hebrew. And he was like, well, I do read Arabic and all this stuff, and this is what this pew said. I said, is that based off of any history, any research, or is it just based off of what you eye spot or what you think you see? Mainly what I eye spot.
Okay, so the gist of that clip is that an external tour guide was saying that he saw Arabic on the pews, and the response, again, was that it would be better to go by the surrounding historical context rather than just what he saw. And to that sort of argument, which again, this is an argument that I think Benayah Israel pioneered. He was presenting this sort of argument years ago. But I have two objections to that sort of argument. My first objection is that you should determine what language appears in a set of markings by examining the markings themselves. And my second objection will be that the surrounding historical context actually supports Arabic more than it does Hebrew, ironically. So let's get into that first objection, and let's do so with a couple of thought experiments. First, permit me to share that my own grandfather's first language was Ilocano, which was his mother's language, right? And permit me to also note that in the 1930s, my grandfather lived in Newark, New Jersey. Now, with that information in mind, suppose we found something which my grandfather wrote back then, which is to say back in the 1930s, back when he was living in Newark. And suppose we wanted to know if that text was written in Ilocano or perhaps in one of the other languages which my grandfather knew, like English or Spanish or Tagalog, right? We would determine what language was present in that piece of writing by looking at the words and the phrases and the sentences in the writing itself. An objection along the lines of, I'm not aware of other evidence of people writing Ilocano in Newark, that sort of objection wouldn't tell us whether Ilocano was actually present in the writing we were looking at. Talking about the apparent lack of recorded Ilocano from the 1930s in Newark would not preclude Ilocano from being present in the piece of writing we were looking at, right? Is that clear? Now, maybe that example might be a bit too abstract for some, so let's consider a different thought experiment which uses English as an example instead. Suppose you were an astronaut, right, working for NASA, and suppose you got sent on America's first manned trip to Mars. And imagine you got off the spaceship, and while exploring the surface of Mars, you came across markings that look like this. Do you see coherent language in those markings? And if you do, might that language be English? But what if someone told you that, aside from what you see, there's no evidence of English speakers on Mars? Would that dissuade you from concluding that the markings you were looking at were in fact English? Would you be dissuaded from that? Or would you still conclude that English is present just from looking at the markings alone, right? Or if you want a less wild analogy, we could propose something different. We could say, imagine you went to a remote jungle where very few people have been before, and suppose while you're there, you found an English language newspaper on the ground. Even if people tried to assure you that there is no other evidence of English in that area, you could still determine the language of that text was English, right? Assurances that you should base your conclusion on the surrounding context, not what you see in the text, might feel a bit like gaslighting, right? So the overall point that I'm trying to make is that when you're trying to determine if a language is present in a set of markings, you determine it from the markings themselves, right? I think that should be clear, right? If you were looking at a piece of English text, you would be able to determine that it's English from the letters, the words, the phrases, the sentences, from the markings themselves, right? You wouldn't need to make recourse to the surrounding context. But consider this. If we're going to base our conclusion on what was most common in the time and area in which the pews were marked, then we should probably conclude that the language on the pews is English, as clearly English was far and away the most dominant language in the 19th century southern United States, right? But I'm guessing the proponents of this consider the context approach don't like that conclusion. So for this video, let's remove English as an option, and let's narrow our options to just Hebrew and Arabic. And that brings us to my second objection, which is that, ironically, the surrounding historical context actually supports Arabic more than it does Hebrew. So let's run through this really quickly. First, we have this pew, which might have La ilaha illallah sloppily etched into it. And, perhaps it was made by the unsteady hand of someone with a shaky familiarity with written Arabic. But the proposed reading is not implausible, and it has the backing of at least one scholar. It was a linguist from Harvard, Boubacar Diakite. And Kelly Richardson over at the We Woke Now channel has already conceded that this phrase appears several times in the diary of Bilali Muhammad, a 19th century slave who lived on nearby Sapelo Island, also in Georgia. But you don't have to take the good doctor's word for it. Rather, you can examine the diary for yourself. This is from a page in the Bilali diary, and I'd like to focus in on this portion right here. That's one place where Bilali wrote La ilaha illallah. It's even an instance where he seems to have not crossed the lam and alif in la or illa. similar to what was proposed for the pew. Now, admittedly, in other places, he does cross lam and alif, but it's interesting that here's an example of him not crossing those letters. And now let's move on from that to this pew, for which 3 different scholars, independently of each other, proposed the phrase ilahi nas. And a couple of those scholars suggested the more expansive phrase an-nas ilahi nas. And this string of words too has appeared in the writings of slaves in the southern United States. And for that, I'd like to turn to this interesting page on the website of America's Islamic Heritage Museum, where there's some discussion on the 1786 Charno Arabic letter, which is an Arabic text written by a slave named Charno who was in South Carolina. On this page is this video, which I'd like to play for you now. Listen as the host talks about how the Charno letter included the last chapters of the Quran, and note how at the end of the video he connects it with the pews in Savannah. This will run for about 1 minute and 45 seconds. Here we go.
In 1768, there was a letter that was written by an African that was enslaved. His name was Charno. And they found this back in 1768. And if I'm not mistaken, it took them at least 30 plus years to be able to do the translation of it. And he writes in Arabic but used the Jami script. What I found very unique is that they told us as African Americans that we couldn't read and write. We had no culture and had no education. They said we could read and write. We had an education, we had a culture, a refined culture, a refined religious culture. Within there, he writes 4 of the last surahs of the Holy Quran. 3 of them we call the cool surahs. The surahs that you seek protection from God, from created things, from whispering the devils. And he used that. These are some of the ending prayers. They were seeking help and protection, as well as the Al-Fatiha. So you see there was a religious consciousness there, and I found it very, very, very unique. And I believe it was William Hodges that was finally able to do the translation after 50 years. Probably it was 50 years before William Hodges was able to do the translation, before they even knew what he wrote. So some of the same type of writing you find in the church in Georgia on these pews on the 2nd floor, which they call the Jami script.
Okay, and once again, you don't have to take that speaker's word for it, as right underneath the video is an image of the relevant text. And as he said, the last chapters of the Quran do appear in this text. For example, the 112th chapter, Surat Al-Ikhlas, appears here. And more relevant to this video, the 114th chapter, Surat An-Nas, appears here. This is the chapter that includes the words in question, the words which were proposed for that pew. And if it helps, I made this transcription to clarify what's there, noting in red where there's something, a little bit extra, additional text, additional letters or markings. For example, at the end of the first line, when he wrote Maliki Nas, he apparently ran out of space, so he didn't write the last letter, the sin, and then he rewrote An-Nas on the next line. So altogether, the end of the first line, together with the beginning of the second line, read Maliki Na An-Nas. So I put the first instance of Anna, which is An-Nas without the sin, and I put that in red. Also, in that second line, there's an extra stroke, like this diagonal line added within Ilah when he wrote Ilahi Nas, so I marked that extra line in red as well. Also, aside from what's marked in red, I note in gray where he missed the preposition, that being the word fi in that third line. So I put that in gray with a little line signifying where it should have appeared. But what's most relevant here is the start of that second line, where one finds An-Nas, Ilahi Nas, the exact 3 Arabic words which were proposed for that pew, which were proposed by 2 different scholars independently of each other. So let's sum this all up. The 2 Arabic phrases which were proposed for the pews have also been found in the writings of slaves living in the southern United States. Meanwhile, the barely coherent string of characters proposed by Kelly Richardson has not been found in any writing produced by slaves in the Americas. or any other writings for that matter. It's a completely ahistorical string of characters. But the central point here is that if we're going to appeal to the surrounding historical context, then the Arabic phrases should get the nod, as they are actually part of that historical context. They're actually found within that history and context, while the same thing cannot be said for Kelly's proposed string of Hebrew characters. Food for thought. But with that, I'll stop this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. You see, unlike the We Woke Now channel, I don't censor objections here. So feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative, and God bless.